Today's lecture will focus on U.S. imperialism around the turn of the 20th century, and it will be divided into 5 parts. The first part will look at the origins of U.S. imperialism, and it is noteworthy that during Reconstruction, the United States government really had no significant initiatives in terms of foreign affairs. They really didn't have the money, the resources, or the time to expand their interests into other countries. However, at the turn of the century, factors ranging from the end of the American frontier, the closing of the American frontier, to increased industrial production, led the U.S. to look beyond its borders, to look into other countries for new opportunities. Now, countries in Europe were also building empires through global power and trade at the same time, and the U.S. wanted a piece of the pie. Now, as of 1865, the U.S. Department of State had 60 employees and no ambassadors abroad. In fact, they only had 24 American foreign ministers, which were located in key countries, and usually these positions were gained through bribes. America also had no strong Navy presence, particularly after the Civil War and the sorts of repercussions that resulted from that. And a Navy was needed for a strong international presence. In fact, in the last half of the century, the United States government decommissioned many of their naval ships. And in fact, they only had 13 all-steel, triple-hulled steam engine vessels in 1890. Now, in spite of the fact that American foreign policy was lacking in many respects in the second half of the 20th century, there were some individual efforts, particularly by the Secretaries of State, which controlled the United States foreign policy during this period. A prime example is William Seward, who was Secretary of State from 1861 to 1869. And his key achievement was actually extending the political and commercial interests of the United States in both South America and Asia during this period. Some examples of the steps that he took to extend this influence include a treaty with Nicaragua, which really set the course for the Panama Canal, which would be made at the turn of the century. He also annexed the Midway Islands in the Pacific Ocean, which created a stable route for trading vessels to Asian markets. Moreover, in 1867, Seward also obtained the Alaskan territory from the Kingdom of Russia for a purchase price of $7.2 million. Now, this was ultimately labeled by newspapers as Seward's folly. And a lot of people thought this was just a complete waste of money getting this large portion of land, which was frozen for most of the year. However, gold was later found in Alaska, as was discussed in a previous lecture, as well as vast mineral resources. And so the Alaskan purchase actually proved to be very profitable for the United States. Now, here's a picture of Seward and Seward's folly. You can see him pointing at the globe, and a picture of Canada during this period. Another example of a Secretary of State who really made some real efforts in terms of international foreign policy during this period was a man by the name of Hamilton Fish, who was Secretary of State after the previous individual from 1869 to 1877. Now, Hamilton Fish's key foreign policies really involved settling a number of international disputes during this period. And the key international dispute which he solved were claims that British assistance to the Confederacy actually prolonged the Civil War for 2 years. And the United States wanted some sort of reparations for that. Now, the reparations that they wanted were called the Alabama claims. And it basically charged that the Confederacy won a number of battles with a British cruiser's help. And basically the United States demanded that Britain pay $2 billion US dollars in reparations as a result of this. Alternatively, Hamilton Fish also gave Britain the alternative to give the United States rights to the entire Canadian part of North America. Now, ultimately, a joint commission was formed because these qualifications were totally outside of the bounds of any sort of normal diplomacy. And the joint commission settled on a $15 million reparation, which was a large step away from the $2 billion that Fish originally asked for. Now, one of the main reasons that the American foreign policies expanded during this period, and especially expanded at the turn of the 20th century, were really business interests and the desire by businesses in the United States to expand internationally. By forging new and stronger ties overseas, this would actually give businesses access to more international markets for export, and plus they would get better deals for raw materials, which they needed to produce their products. Now, the Depression, which we've talked about in other lectures in the 1890s, ultimately strengthened the resolve of businesses in the U.S., and you can actually see throughout this period that U.S. exports started to skyrocket as the late 19th century progressed. I've given you some of the figures on this slide, and you can see that in 1865, U.S. exports totaled $234 million. It was doubled, there was over double this amount in 1875, and by 1898, exports from the U.S. totaled $1.3 billion, which was actually on the eve of the American War with Spain, also known as the Spanish-American War, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Now, businesses were not the only group which wanted to expand into new international territories during this period. In fact, progressive reformers and also religious leaders wanted to spread the democratic values and also the Christian influence of the United States abroad. And in fact, in terms of the progressive reformers, many of them actually viewed imperialism and progressivism as being compatible in many ways. And they thought that the impulses for democratic values and democracy itself actually translated well abroad. And in fact, editors of some of the magazines that we've discussed about, such as Century Magazine, Outlook Magazine, and Harper's Weekly, which was the magazine where many of the cartoons that we've looked at were extracted, really supported the imperialistic stance as the democratic responsibility of the United States. As mentioned, religious groups also supported the spread of the United States values throughout the world, and several Protestant faiths formed missionary societies in the years after the Civil War to spread Christian values into areas like Asia and South America. Now, these groups were led by institutions such as the American Board of Commissioners on Foreign Missions, and missionaries set about to spread Christian ethics with American values. It's noteworthy that the ethics were conflated with American values, and they began to spread both gospels with zeal during this period, both the religious gospel and the democratic gospel. Now, it's noteworthy that women were about 60% of the workforce of Christian missionary organizations during this period. And by 1870, these Christian groups spent as much time advocating the American version of modern civilization as they did teaching the Bible. Now, in many ways, the social reformers of the early progressive era also mirrored the actions of the missionaries. However, it's noteworthy that as opposed to the missionaries, which were influenced by the teachings in the Bible, the social reformers were often influenced by scholarship based on race-based intelligence. And many of these individuals embraced social Darwinist theory that basically advocated that inferior races were destined to poverty because of their lower evolutionary status. And basically they viewed themselves and they thought that they owed less evolved populations both their stewardship and the social uplift that their progressive ideas could bring. Now, while the work of businessmen and missionaries and progressive reformers really set the stage for international expansion, in the early 1990s is when things really took off. And people really embraced the idea of an expanded foreign policy and a vision of an American empire. Now, one of the main reasons for this is that many of the individuals in the 1890s were really too young to remember the devastation wrought upon the country during the Civil War, and they were eager to be tested in international conflict, international war, and exploring the sort of military conquests that could be available. A prime example of this is the Assistant Secretary of Navy at this time, who was Theodore Roosevelt. We'll talk about him a little bit later on and his Rough Riders during the Spanish-American War. However, there were two key individuals who really propagated the idea of an American empire during the 1890s. One of these individuals was Frederick Jackson Turner, who's the name given on this slide. Now, Turner was a primary example of the sorts of individuals which arose during this period, which had the concepts that empire was good. And basically, he was a historian, and he had a theory that the reason that the United States was so successful is because they always had a frontier. That frontier was the main reason for the United States' growth, for its success, and for the amount of money which the United States now had. And he encouraged new outlets for population growth. He encouraged businesses to find new markets. And Turner's thesis was extremely influential at the time, even though it has subsequently been criticized by historians. In fact, many historians now do not view frontier as being a key element for the success of America during the 19th century. However, it's also noteworthy that his thesis really underscores the pervasive racism and disregard for indigenous communities in the borderlands and in other countries at this time. Americans did not view other communities, other cultural groups, other nations as having the same destiny, as having the same rights, and as having the same values that they did. Now here's a picture of Frederick Turner. The other individual that was significant during this period was Alfred Thayer Mahan. Now, while Turner provided the idea for an empire, Mahan actually provided a practical guide for how to do this. And this practical guide was found in a book which he published in 1890, which was titled The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And basically, this book gave three key strategies for building an empire. First of all, any empire, he asserted, had to have a strong navy, and he really advocated that the United States build a stronger navy. He also advocated that the United States establish a network of naval bases, which would allow them to fuel the expanding fleet that they were created. And actually, the acquisition of the Midway Islands, which we discussed about, and it was acquired in the mid-19th century, shortly after the Civil War, actually served this purpose, and it was served as a coaling station for the steam-powered warships which existed. Now finally, Mahan urged the construction of a canal across the Isthmus of Central America, which would basically decrease the amount of time needed to cross the ocean by 2/3 and move the power to the United States, because now it would have access to both the Pacific and the Atlantic very quickly. And the government, it's noteworthy, the government actually really seized upon the ideas of Alfred Thayer Mahan. It passed the Naval Act of 1890 very quickly, which set production levels for a new and modern fleet. And by 1898, it actually had 160 new naval vessels, and 114 of these were built of steel, which proved to be a much stronger material than the iron which was used in previous naval vessels. Now, 6 of these 160 vessels were battleships, and this new effort by the United States after the Naval Act of 1890 actually catapulted the United States into the position of the 3rd strongest naval power in the world, trailing only Spain and Great Britain. Now here is a map showing the imperial acquisitions of the United States during this period. We'll talk about many of these in a minute, but this was ultimately made possible through the efforts that the United States had after the Naval Act of 1890. And you can notice that many of the acquisitions, such as the Philippine Islands, Guam, and the Hawaiian Islands, American Samoa, were acquired after this act was passed. Now that brings us to Hawaii. The United States really expanded its influence to other Pacific islands during this period, many of which we just looked at, such as Samoa. However, Hawaii was very intriguing for businessmen during this period because they were interested in its very successful sugar industry. In fact, by 1890, Hawaiians exported most of their sugar to the United States because of the eagerness of businessmen, and they did this tariff-free. Now, there were many native Hawaiians who were very unhappy with this situation. It's noteworthy that the Queen of Hawaii at this time actually tapped into a strong anti-American resentment among natives of the island because of the fact that Americans were being so exploitive of the native sugar industry between 1891 and 1893. So the Queen for a while was pretty successful in warding this off. However, businessmen, because they already had an interest here, worked with a man by the name of John Stevens, who was the American minister of Hawaii, to stage a quick armed revolt and seize the Hawaiian Islands as an American protectorate, which basically means that they would control the government of the island. Now, ultimately, after the seizure of the Hawaiian Islands, it took 5 more years of political wrangling, but ultimately, in 1898, the United States annexed Hawaii during the Spanish-American War, which we'll talk about in the next section. Now here is a picture of Queen Lila'uokalani of Hawaii, and you can actually see that the Queen appeared at the Capitol during this period to try and acquire reparations for the loss of her kingdom. Now this brings us to part 2 of the lecture, namely the Spanish-American War, which we've discussed a lot about in the previous slides. And it's noteworthy that this was the first international military conflict for the United States since 1812. 1846. And it was actually a milestone in the development of the United States as an empire. Now, the reason for the war ultimately revolved around the rights of Cuban rebels to fight for freedom from Spain. And that is what the war really centered around. Now, by 1890, the only Spanish colonies that had not acquired independence within South America were Cuba and Puerto Rico. And Cuban freedom fighters in what was known as the Cuba Libre movement were very unsuccessful prior to American intervention. In 1895, they had a major revolt, which was led by the Cuba Libre movement. And as a result of this, the Spanish forces ultimately rounded up the rebels and put them into urban camps, where many died, actually, from the harsh conditions that they were exposed to. Now, the Americans were very sympathetic to this, and they learned about it through newspapers and other sorts of media. Moreover, both shippers and businessmen who were involved in the sugar industry actually supported American intervention in the Cuban freedom fighter movement to protect their interests in the country. Now, supporters thought that a new U.S. Navy could really help in this situation. And sensationalist yellow journalism, such as the New York Journal, which was published by William Randolph Hearst, and the New York World newspaper, which was actually published by Joseph Pulitzer, who the Pulitzer Prize is named after, competed for readership during this period with very elaborate stories that encouraged the war. Now, the president during this period was William McKinley, and he knew that the American Navy prior to this point was very untested, and he was very hesitant to devote naval forces to the rebel cause in Cuba. Moreover, he didn't see war with Spain, which, as was discussed in a previous slide, had the best and the most well-equipped navy in the world, as being a really good bet for the country. However, he did admonish Spain and urged a peaceful solution to the crisis. Here is a Spanish cartoon from the period, actually giving you an impression of what Spain thought of the sorts of American movements. And you'll notice in the caption at the bottom that it says, "Keep the island so it won't get lost." And this is how Spanish individuals on mainland Europe thought of what America was trying to do and trying to influence during this period. Now, ultimately, everything changed in February 1898. And a large reason for this was the USS Maine. Now, the USS Maine was a new battleship in the U.S. fleet, and it was ordered to drop anchor off of Cuba to basically observe the situation and prepare to evacuate American citizens who were living on the island if it proved to be necessary. However, days after the USS Maine set anchor, an explosion destroyed the entire ship, and 250 sailors were killed. Now, yellow journalists such as William Randolph Hearst, Joseph Pulitzer, and others basically had a field day with this particular explosion, and they used it as a rally cry to go to war in Cuba. And in fact, there was a battle cry in newspapers that said, "Remember the Maine." However, recent evidence suggests that it was probably an accident due to the storage of gunpowder near boilers in the ship, which were very hot. However, the newspapers had no such evidence of this and really supported the cry for war. Now here's a newspaper from the period which expressed the sort of yellow journalism which existed. And you'll notice that the headline says, "The destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy." Now, McKinley once again tried to avoid war, and he made one last effort to do so. And basically, his ultimatum was this. He called on Spain to end its policy of concentrating the native population in military camps in Cuba, and he also ordered Spain to declare Cuba's independence. Now, these were two major requests, especially the second of the two, and Spain obviously or naturally refused. Now, immediately after this, McKinley requested a declaration of war from the U.S. Congress, and shortly thereafter, on April 19th, 1898, Congress recognized officially that Cuba was independent, and it authorized McKinley to use military to remove Spain from the island. During the same session, it also passed what was known as the Teller Amendment, which basically stated that the United States wouldn't annex Cuba after the war. So this basically ensured Cuban rebels that they could rely on the United States if they were not there to take over their country. Now, the war itself was ultimately very brief and decisive. In fact, it only lasted 10 weeks, and it had a very clear outcome, namely that the U.S. triumphed in liberating Cuba from Spanish control. However, like McKinley feared, it did bring a number of challenges. The ships were very untested during the conflict, as were the soldiers, and many were actually unprepared to battle with a very formidable Spanish opponent. Now, ultimately, what made the difference in the war is that it attracted numerous volunteers, which made up the difference. In fact, over 1 million men, many of which had no uniforms and actually brought their own guns into battle, answered McKinley's call for able-bodied men during the conflict. Moreover, it's noteworthy that 10,000 African Americans actually volunteered as well, despite the fact that they were often exposed to racism and segregated conditions. Now, the government, in spite of the fact that they were very happy that numerous volunteers were able to contribute to the conflict, was ultimately unprepared to feed and supply so many men, and many actually suffered from ailments such as malnutrition and malaria during the conflict. Now here is a photograph of black soldiers in the Spanish-American War, and as noted before, they did contribute very strongly to the United States' success in the conflict. Now, ultimately, Spanish forces were surprised by American military strategy because they realized soon after the declaration of war that America was not only interested in Cuba, but they were also interested in establishing an empire. And ultimately, what the Americans did is they took advantage of the conflict to expand their markets into China, because American industrialists were very interested in getting closer to China and having ways to exploit the Chinese population. Ultimately, before leaving his post as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy to serve as the Lieutenant Colonel in the U.S. Cavalry, Theodore Roosevelt was also involved in the expansion into Asia, and he ordered Navy ships to attack the Spanish fleet in the Philippines as well. Now, this was actually the first military conflict of the war, and it actually didn't occur in Cuba, but in the Philippines. The conflict was ultimately led by a man named Commodore George Dewey, and he led the U.S. Navy to a very decisive victory in the Philippines, sinking all of the Spanish ships, and no American ships were lost. Ultimately, the United States was able to take the Philippine Islands by mid-August 1899, but the Spanish War continued. Now, ultimately, victory in Cuba took much longer, and it all started in June 1899 when 17,000 troops landed in Cuba. By early July, fierce battles near the Spanish stronghold of the city of Santiago in Cuba had broken out. And during this battle, famously, Theodore Roosevelt led his Rough Riders, which was an all-volunteer cavalry made up of adventure-seeking college graduates and veterans and cowboys from the American Southwest, in a charge up San Juan Hill, which resulted in the surrounding of Santiago. Now, ultimately, as mentioned before, African American regiments also played a key role in the battle. And as the Spanish tried to escape from Santiago and ultimately Cuba itself in their ships, they ran into the American naval blockade, and every Spanish vessel leaving Cuba was sunk. With no naval support, the Spanish ultimately lost Puerto Rico as well, with no resistance whatsoever. And by the end of July, the war was over with fewer than 350 American casualties. It is also noteworthy that the war carried significance for the American country in general, because this was the first time that the North and South had teamed up since the Civil War to accomplish something together. And it was seen as a time of reconciliation between the North and the South. Now here's a picture illustrating the Rough Riders' march up San Juan Hill, and you can see Theodore Roosevelt in the center. Now ultimately this brings us to part 3 of the lecture, namely creating an empire. And the creation of the American empire really started with what was known as the Treaty of Paris. Now as the war closed, Spanish and American diplomats made arrangements for peace at a conference in Paris. And they met in October 1898. And the Spanish government at this meeting was really committed to regaining the Philippines because they thought it was unjustly taken from them during the Spanish-American War, which really focused on Cuban independence. Now, as can be imagined, McKinley, who was still president at this point, was very reluctant to give up the Philippines. And Spain ultimately agreed to recognize Cuba's independence and American control of Puerto Rico and Guam during the conference, but they insisted on control of the Philippines as well. Now, the United States made a deal with Spain, namely that they could get the Philippines in return for $20 million, which would be given to Spain. Ultimately, Spain was very reluctant, but they were really in no military position to deny America this demand. And the Treaty of Paris was ultimately finalized on December 10th, 1898, with Spain granting rights to the Philippines to the United States for this $20 million fee. Ultimately, by doing this, they recognized America as an empire, and the Treaty of Paris was truly glorified in the American media and press as the beginning of an empire. Now here is an illustration of the thoughts of the American Empire and the results of the 1898 Spanish-American War, and you can see the wings of the American bald eagle spreading from Puerto Rico all the way into the Asian islands. And it says 10,000 miles from tip to tip. Now, domestically, not all Americans were unified in support of the Treaty of Paris or the idea of empire building. And many of these individuals were actually famous, such as Jane Addams, who was instrumental in the Chicago housing movement, Grover Cleveland, the ex-president of the United States, Andrew Carnegie, the industrial tycoon, and Mark Twain, the author, were all opposed to the idea that the U.S. should pursue an empire. And in 1898, they formed what was known as the Anti-Imperialist League to oppose expansionism by the United States. Now, ultimately, the reasons for the League and the reasons expressed by the individuals in the League against expansionism varied in a number of ways. Some thought that expansionism was against the principles of democracy and freedom. Some thought that competition would evolve for foreign workers as a result of the influx of individuals from other countries into the United States and into the American economy. And some also held the xenophobic viewpoint that assimilation and the incorporation of other cultures would actually hurt the United States, which was based on Anglo-Saxon Christian values. However, despite this, the group formed a formidable challenge to empire building in the United States during this period. And they formed a very strong lobby group in Washington. Now, it must be noted that foreign treaties required 2/3 majority from the Senate in order to be passed, and this included the Treaty of Paris, which was just discussed in a previous slide. Now, the Anti-Imperialist League put pressure on the Congress, and this ultimately led to a split in the Congress, which threatened the ratification of the Treaty of Paris. And in fact, the only reason that the Treaty of Paris was ultimately ratified is because 1 week before the vote, a new Filipino uprising basically reached the American public, and senators were convinced of the need for a presence in the Philippines and a preemptive intervention from European powers, an attempt to preempt intervention from European powers in the Philippines, particularly Spain. Ultimately, as a result of this, the Treaty of Paris was ratified on February 6, 1899. But as noted, the Anti-Imperialist League did form a strong and powerful force in the American political system. Now, as just discussed, 1 week before the Congress or the Senate was due to vote on the ratification of the Treaty of Paris, news reached the American public of an uprising in the Philippines, and rebels led by a man named Emilio Aguinaldo fought back against American forces in the Philippines during this period and actually created a war which lasted 3 years. And during this war, 4,000 Americans, 20,000 Filipinos, and numerous other civilians, which are estimated to be 250,000 in number, died during combat. Ultimately, this threatened the new American empire. However, McKinley ultimately appointed William Howard Taft as the civil governor of the Philippines to disengage American military from direct confrontations so less people would die. And under the leadership of Taft, new transportation infrastructure was built, hospitals, schools, etc., which served to pacify the Filipino public. Eventually, Aguinaldo was captured and forced to swear allegiance to the United States. And the Taft Commission, as it was known, ultimately introduced reforms to modernize the islands, to bring a more modern lifestyle to the public. And they also offered appointments to resistance leaders in exchange for political support. So if a resistance leader would pledge allegiance to the United States, they would be put in a political position within the new Taft Commission, as it was called. Now, the Philippines remained under American rule until 1946. So the United States was very successful in bringing the Philippines under control as a result of the Taft Commission. However, this just goes to show the length that America was willing to go to extend and solidify its empire. Here's a picture of the Filipino president, Emilio Aguinaldo. And ultimately, after the Filipino War, the U.S. continued to acquire other territories to try and build up its empire. As mentioned, they acquired Hawaii, and it was granted territorial status in 1900, which made the inhabitants citizens. Alaska became a territory in 1912. And the Four-Acre Act of 1900 also made Puerto Rico a territory, but it was not until 1917 that citizenship was granted to the inhabitants of the island. Ultimately, Guam and Samoa were placed under the U.S. Navy, and as mentioned, Cuba was ultimately free as a result of the Teller Amendment, but it adopted a constitution based on the U.S. Constitution, so it was very favorable to the United States. And while the Teller Amendment prohibited the United States from annexing Cuba, the later amendment known as the Platt Amendment secured the right of the United States to interfere in Cuban affairs where necessary, especially if threats to a stable government on the island emerged. Moreover, the Platt Amendment also guaranteed that the U.S. had its own naval and coaling station on the island's southern Guantanamo Bay, and it prohibited Cuba from making treaties with other countries which could threaten Cuba's independence. So basically, unofficially, it made Cuba a protectorate of the United States, although on paper it was still free. Now this ultimately brings us to the fourth part of the lecture, namely America's economic empire, which differs in many respects from the military empire that was discussed in the previous section. Now, ultimately, America was very interested in China, and they actually had a dream of the Chinese market, or the China market, as it was known. Now, America now had a base on the Philippines for American ports and coaling stations to attempt to gain access to Chinese resources. And they were ready to make a Chinese market a reality by the turn of the 20th century. Now, captains of American industry dreamt for a long time of the vast markets of Asian customers that would be desperate for manufactured goods that they couldn't produce themselves. And America was actually not alone in this respect. In fact, 5 other countries during this period were also interested in getting involved in the China market, including Britain, Japan, Russia, Germany, and France. And before America acquired the Philippines, each of these countries had already carved out their own sphere of influence in the region. Germany, for example, had gained mining rights on the northern coast of China as reparations for the murder of 2 German missionaries in the preceding years. And the United States, was very alarmed that countries like Germany would begin dividing up China. So ultimately, they intervened, and unlike the Europeans, who were willing to settle for divisions of China or sections of China to do business, American businesses wanted the whole market, not just a share. So, with the blessing of the Secretary of State at the time, whose name was John Hay, businessmen created the American Asiatic Association in 1896 to pursue trade opportunities in China. Now, in 1899, Hay introduced what was known as the Open Door Notes, which were sent to all of the 5 countries which were just discussed previously. And essentially, these were a series of circular notes drafted by Hay, which basically expressed U.S. interests in the regions and what they wanted to accomplish there. And if agreed to by the 5 countries just mentioned, it would erase all divisions and all spheres of influence, and would basically open up doors in the country to free trade with no tariffs, which would give one country an advantage over another. Now, the specifications of the Open Door Notes were essentially the following. First of all, they agreed to free access to all treaty ports in China. They would also pay railroad charges and harbor fees. And only China would collect taxes on the border. So none of the other 6 countries, the United States included, would be able to collect taxes. Now, ultimately, this appeared very fair in theory, but it ultimately gave the United States an advantage. And this was largely because American businesses created higher quality goods than the other 5 countries at the time, and they were also a lot more efficient and less expensive than the businesses in the other countries. And basically, what this would allow America to do, what these Open Door Notes would allow America to do, is to flood the market with American goods and squeeze the other 5 countries out. Now here's a cartoon from the period exemplifying the open door policy and how other countries viewed it. And you can see it says trade treaty in the hand of the American. The other 5 countries are ready to cut up China, but America does not want this. Now, ultimately, the foreign ministers of the other countries sent very half-hearted replies to Hay in response to the Open Door Notes. Some even denied the viability of the notes. However, Hay proclaimed them to be the new official policy on China, and he started unleashing American goods throughout the country as a response. Now, China was very welcoming as the notes, primarily because they stressed U.S. commitment to preserve the Chinese government and the territorial integrity of the Chinese country. And these promises were ultimately invoked 1 year later when Chinese insurgents, known as the Righteous and Harmonious Fists, or the Boxer Rebellion, fought to expel all 6 Western nations and their influences from China. They thought that China was being infiltrated by the other 6 countries, and they wanted to expel them. Now, the United States, Great Britain, and Germany ultimately teamed up, and they sent 2,000 troops to help the Chinese government against the Boxer Rebellion. They were ultimately successful. However, after this, a number of other elements also occurred in China, which forced the Chinese to rely on the United States to help them. In 1915, Japan tried to undermine Chinese authority by sending troops into the country, and the United States helped. In 1931, there was the Manchurian crisis, in which the United States helped as well. And the United States ultimately remained resolute in defense of the open door principles throughout the entire first half of the 20th century, for the first 50 years of the 20th century, until World War II broke out. In fact, only after 1949 and the Communist Revolution with Mao Zedong did the principle of the open door policy become meaningless in terms of Chinese and American relations. Here is a picture of individuals from the Boxer Rebellion. And this ultimately brings us to the last part of the lecture, namely the presidential involvement in imperialism and the steps that the presidents took to make sure that the empire, or the United States empire, succeeded during this period. Now, while William McKinley ushered in an era of American empire through military strength and economic coercion, especially in the case of China, Theodore Roosevelt ultimately established a new foreign policy approach, and his foreign policy approach was known as Big Stick foreign policy. And the Big Stick foreign policy was based on the African proverb to speak softly and carry a big stick, and you will go far. And basically what this meant was that at the crux of his foreign policy was a thinly veiled threat. Basically, Roosevelt considered it unnecessary to use force as long as the military could threaten force. And it basically rested on the president's philosophy, termed the strenuous life, that saw challenges overseas as opportunities to instill men with resolve and vigor that they once acquired in the American West. And he basically believed that the Western Hemisphere's best interests were the best interests of the United States, and he believed that the United States had the right and the obligation to be the policeman of the hemisphere. Here's an illustration showing the Big Stick foreign policy and how people viewed it during this period. And this ultimately brings us to one of the first things that President Roosevelt did, namely the negotiation for the Panama Canal. And this really illustrates the Big Stick foreign policy. Now, there had been attempts by France to construct a canal across Central America between 1881 and 1894. But ultimately, this attempt failed due to both financial crises and health hazards, particularly malaria and yellow fever, which resulted in the deaths of thousands of French workers during this period. However, Roosevelt was ultimately very determined to succeed. And he wanted the canal for military reasons and international trade considerations. Ultimately, he identified what the best point for the canal was, and this was the 50-mile isthmus of Panama, which was actually part of the nation of Colombia at the time. Now, he negotiated with Colombia, and Colombia ultimately rejected, and he threatened to move the project to Nicaragua. However, ultimately, Colombia agreed to a treaty that granted the United States a lease on the land, this 50-mile isthmus, in exchange for $10 million and a $250,000 annual rental fee. Now, many people in Colombia were outraged at this treaty and at the loss of land, at the low payment. And ultimately, the Colombian Senate, who, like the American Senate, would reject or accept treaties, rejected the treaty and informed President Roosevelt that no canal would be built on this part of land. At this point, Roosevelt ultimately wields his big stick, and he basically conveyed to journalists in the United States that the U.S. would support the Panamanian people who lived in this region if they chose to revolt against Colombia and form their own nation. Now, ultimately, the Panamanian people did revolt against Colombia with U.S. backing, and in 1903, the United States sent battleships to the coast as the Panamanian Revolution unfolded. Ultimately, what these battleships did is they blocked Colombia from moving troops to the region to quell the uprising, and within a week, Roosevelt recognized the new country of Panama and offered Panama the same terms that had just offered Colombia, namely $10 million of an initial fee and $250,000 annually for rental. And ultimately, Panama, as a result of this, became an American protectorate, and it remained so until 1939. Now, construction on the canal itself began in May of 1904, and ultimately it was far more successful than the earlier French attempts because Roosevelt and the scientists who helped him installed mosquito nets, which helped to protect the workers from yellow fever and malaria, etc. And they were also more successful because, as opposed to building a straight canal, they decided on a lock system, which was far superior to the sea level canal because of the industrial undertaking that it would take to produce such a engineering work. Now, Roosevelt was very excited and very enthusiastic about this project, and he actually became the first U.S. president to leave the United States while in office, and he traveled to Panama to visit the construction site himself. Now, after 10 years, the canal finally opened in 1914, and the opening of the canal permanently changed world trade and military defense patterns in favor of the United States. Here's an illustration or a picture showing the construction of the Panama Canal. And ultimately, this brings us to the Roosevelt Corollary, which was established during this period as well. And basically, what Roosevelt wanted to do is he wanted to send a message to Europe that colonization in the Western Hemisphere had ended for European countries. Moreover, he also wanted to send a message to Central and South America that they would intervene to maintain peace and stability in the hemisphere. So in other words, if one country threatened another, the United States would intervene and stop this conflict. And in 1904, in an address to Congress known as the Roosevelt Corollary, he warned Europeans of the consequences of interference, which was very similar to the Monroe Doctrine, which was issued in the early 19th century, which some of you may have learned about in the first part of this class, which applied to the Caribbean territory. And it also stated that the U.S. would use military force as an international police power to correct any chronic wrongdoing by Latin American countries. Essentially, what it said is that it was the right of the United States to intervene when necessary, whether this be because of the Europeans or the Central or South Americans. Roosevelt put this corollary very quickly to work. He established protectorates over Cuba and Panama, and he also managed the Dominican Republic's customs service revenues as a result of this corollary. And the Roosevelt corollary and the implications of it really continued to dominate Central and South America throughout much of the 20th century. Now here's an effect of, or a map showing the effects of the Roosevelt corollary. Now another prime example of the big stick foreign policy of Theodore Roosevelt was American intervention in the Russian and Japanese War of 1904. And the background of the war was fairly simple. Japan was angered by Russian troops on the Chinese border. The two sides fought. The Japanese fleet was ultimately victorious. And this conflict between Japan and Russia really concerned Roosevelt because he thought it threatened the open door policy and also U.S. business interests in the region. So what he did was he arranged for diplomats from Russia and Japan to attend a secret peace conference in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and Roosevelt ultimately secured peace between the two countries, and Japan got Korea and military bases in Manchuria as a result. Now, it's noteworthy that Roosevelt, as the mediator of this conflict, also won the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts, and he's the first President of the United States to get such an award. Now, between 1906 and 1907, Japan was causing problems once again, and they actually forced American business interests out of Manchuria. Roosevelt brought back his big stick, this time by sending the United States Great White Fleet on maneuvers in the Pacific as a show of force. And they were there from 1907 to 1909, and they sent a clear message to Japan about America's military dominance, and America was able to maintain the open door policy as a result. Now this ultimately brings us to William Howard Taft's diplomatic ideas during this period, and unlike Roosevelt, Taft really used the threat of economic clout to coerce countries into agreements which benefited the United States. Taft was overly concerned about debt owed by Central American countries to European countries during this period. And he thought that the European countries might use the debt as a reason to intervene militarily in these countries and threaten the domination that the U.S. had established in Central and South America. As a result, Taft ultimately paid off the debts of all the Central American countries with U.S. dollars, which ultimately indebted Central Americans to the United States. Now, some Central Americans were very unhappy with this, and Taft would respond militarily as a result. In Nicaragua, for example, they refused to accept American loans to pay off debt to Great Britain, and Taft sent a warship to pressure them to agree. Now, it's noteworthy that as William Howard Taft's presidency came to a close in 1913, the United States was really entrenched on a path towards empire. In fact, the world really viewed the United States at this point as the predominant power of the Western Hemisphere. It was no longer Spain, it was no longer other European countries. It was the United States that was in control of the West. And the United States had also marked its interests in Asia, though many of these were tenuous, particularly in China. However, the playing field of international politics and empire would ultimately change 1 year later in 1914 with the unfolding of the First World War. And we'll talk about that more in the next lecture.